First cab off the rank is going to be talking about some stuff to do with Ukraine and Russia, or more so, there's some Russian stuff in general as well, but we'll start with Ukraine and Russia thing. Now, this article, this opinion piece article, came out last week, 3rd of October, so last Friday, and talking about the basically war economy and production. Now, I talked about this last week that there was an expectation that a lot of the media had driven that Russia was falling behind or unable to keep up with um, military hardware manufacturing, and that, well, they were suffering from material losses, they were suffering raw material issues, and everything else. So there's quite a lot, basically suggesting that there's a lot of bad stuff in the production pipeline for Russia's military hardware and supplies. So an article came out late last week talking about how basically Russia's in a wartime economy, at least is expected to be. Now, there's been issues, and one of the concerns I've had with the whole sanctioning process is that it hasn't had the economic effect on Russia that, well, the politicians selling us on the sanctions said it was going to have. If anything, the sanctions seem to have actually hurt Western economies. Now, you could just say it's coincidental that there are other factors at play causing Western economies to crater, but the sanctions put in place don't seem to be universally applied either, because we had Trump recently having a go at various European NATO members for continuing to purchase Russian oil or use Russian sourced oil and gas and things like that, but mainly the oil. And so if you've got a desire to economically isolate a nation by virtue of sanctions, it doesn't help when everyone keeps purchasing. The other part that doesn't help is that you have to look at the global economic impact. Now, the EU, also America, obviously is probably still the world's largest economy. Russia's a fair way down the list, but in terms of nations that are still willing to trade with Russia, i.e., China, India, Brazil, a bunch of other places, you're looking at over half the world's population that is continuing to willingly trade with Russia. And you're also then dealing, you might say, well, okay, they're economically not that important. Well, China in particular has a very well-developed military. They provide manufacturing for a lot of the world's products. They have a space capability, as do India. And so you've got massive numbers of people in the world who are continuing to trade with a nation that's supposed to be economically isolated. And that is only going to be means that the sanctions are going to have limited effect. Oh, we'll keep seeing how it rolls. But the point here is that, well, one of the other points too, I guess, is the economic sanctions are based on basically looking at the nation as having a similar economic structure to a Western nation, a European nation. But Russia's economy used to, I don't know if it still is, be heavily reliant on raw materials. And they had a lot of in-country manufacturing, onshoring stuff. I mean, the sort of stuff Trump is advocating for in the US attempt to bring manufacturing back on shore. Russia had a fair amount of that already, either as holdovers from the Cold War, where they were never going to get Western supplies, or because they had the capability to develop themselves, or because sanctions forced them into that role down track. It's not like they were not known for having any smart people, or historically for having manufacturing capability within the nation. Now, the quality of those products might be called into question, but they've had that capacity. So the idea that you can sanction a net exporter of materials in the same way that you might economically sanction a European nation, it's going to have a different level of effect. And if there's still billions of people willing to purchase those raw materials, you're still going to have foreign you're still going to have foreign income. What's the name for it? Foreign currency reserves. So it's the sanctions, economic sanctions. I don't know how effective ultimately they've been as a weapon of war, but according to the article here, Russia's definitely gone on a military footing and militarized a lot of their production. Well, given the size of the country, it may only still be a fraction of overall output. But we did look at an article last week talking about how the drone production has caught back up. Well, basically, it's caught back up or has been created and is producing enough unmanned vehicles to continue very, very, very sustained attacks against Ukraine at levels that weren't possible even a couple of years ago. So that's where this whole idea of, look, all this stuff we're hearing about the impending collapse of the Russian economy, the mass destruction of oil facilities, things like that, it needs to be looked at as well if all of that is as it said, we should see corresponding secondary effects. We should see either gains on the battlefield, or we should see a corresponding reduction in levels of attack, that sort of thing, which isn't what's there. Now, we had some people come out and comment and have a bit of a go at that idea, and, well, I don't mind that, but if you're just going to repeat what the media's already said, well, I've already covered what the media said and why it's potentially missing the mark. So this article isn't beyond pushing the fear of, I know Russia's going to roll west again. Again, I don't see that, particularly after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, and even during the Cold War, when the Warsaw Pact was still around. Yep, they had definitely had an offensive capability, and yes, that was the fear, and that was the whole setup of NATO and everybody else, was to stop the Russians rolling west through the Fulda Gap and everything else. And yes, they had bases in other nations, like Cam Ranh Bay, for example, was a Russian Navy base in Vietnam, but they didn't have deployed bases as much as, say, the US, who had basically shared facilities in Circlic. They had all their bases through Germany, through England, basically anywhere the US had been, there was generally a base left behind, but they still operated. And whilst there certainly was a very big expeditionary force capability developed, I think in hindsight, we look at it as largely almost a defensive type establishment, something that was designed to maintain the status quo. And whilst they might have exercised offensive capabilities, everybody does that, and the Warsaw Pact was almost, or the Iron Curtain, was more to keep the people in than to stop the West coming across, or to stop the East going west. But I mean, I guess that comes with hindsight of 30, 40 years down the track. And yeah, so since the end of the Cold War, though, certainly with the 1991 revolution that Russia had, the collapse of, well, the USSR, the emergence of the CIS, yeah, Russia's largely had regional level concerns. Now, people in Chechnya and Georgia might say it's not really regional, but in terms of Russia's sphere of influence, it certainly shrank after the collapse, after 1991, after the collapse of the USSR. And yeah, the Central Asia certainly has a lot of Russian influence over the top of it. The Baltics obviously did their best to break away. And Finland has always sort of tried to keep Russia at arm's length. But the reality for a lot of people living through those regions is there is still a lot of Russian influence, be it overt, covert, or just because of cultural ties. Same for up in Norway. The border regions are places where there's always been this blend of Russian and host nation type people. So you've got, well, not people, you've got of cultural exchange effectively. So Finland, as much as they're keeping Russia at arm's length, still has quite a lot of cultural ties in a way that link it to Russia. And the same for the Baltics, as much as they keep trying to separate themselves. And ultimately, so does Ukraine. And that comes down to then the whole post-Euromaidan, I mean, the whole reason for Euromaidan in a way, swinging back and forth between pro-EU and pro-Russia political intent. And then after the Euromaidan, you had the Eastern Oblasts that were very much ethnic Russian compared to ethnic European, that decided that it wasn't for them, and so on and so forth. 12 years later, 11 years later, we're still stuck in a war, or they're still stuck in a war. All right, quick rundown. But beyond that, Russia doesn't seem to have shown any real interest to exert military power or demonstrate military power to keep going further to the west. If anything, they've kept mostly to themselves. Yeah, okay, people whining about Ukraine. There's been the alleged spying events and assassinations in various Western nations. Possible. Certainly no different to a lot of other nations are doing or trying to do. So, yeah, this idea that Russia's building up for an attempt to invade NATO within 5 years, I don't see, even in the military build-up, even beforehand, didn't see the sort of, even on a 5-year plan, the sort of build-up that would support an argument like this. And you've got, when, for example, the 2003 invasion of Iraq took place, or even the invasion of Afghanistan post 2001, there was a very clear build-up, and the US quite obviously maintained an expeditionary capability, so did the UK to a limited extent, and other contributing nations had smaller expeditionary capabilities that they sustained. But even then, there was still a significant ramp-up phase. There was not quite a war economy footing, but there was the question about how much capacity could be devoted to those sort of military capabilities for Iraq and Afghanistan. And the markers were there well in advance that this was going to happen. When Ukraine, so when Russia invaded in 2022, there were markers that had been in place for probably 12 to 18 months beforehand, both in what was being said and in terms of military posturing. And one of the military postures that was the case was the persistent deployment, border deployment that was happening in southwest Russia, just across the border, basically pre-positioning. And that then obviously was the precursor that led into the actual invasion. That was where the military hardware and supplies came from. And it's one reason why countries get nervous when Russia and Belarus held exercises near their border, because historically things like that tend to be precursors to people coming across the border. And even with the American-led invasion of Iraq, there was a similar sort of thing. There was an series of exercises being held in the Middle East, in the Gulf region, and people watching logistics saw a higher than average number of troops committed to those exercises, and a logistical pipeline, a logistical chain that suggested a bit more than just an exercise. And lo and behold, a few months later, everything kicks off in Iraq. And this whole idea of understanding the logistic pipelines and chains comes back to actually, well, it's always been a thing. I mean, Napoleon said that an army marches on its stomach. But in terms of modern era military understanding, one of the big things that led to, I guess, better understanding or better observation of logistic pipelines was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Now, they came across land borders easy enough, and they had land supply chains. But what was missed at the time, or wasn't necessarily, it may have been observed, but they didn't understand what they were looking at, was a maritime logistics chain leading through into the Indian Ocean, I think up through Pakistan, I believe, or maybe even in Iran. I'm not 100% sure where they offloaded. But basically there was an increase in shipping traffic ultimately carrying military hardware that was clearly built up before the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And it had happened over a long enough period that a careful observer would have been able to identify what was going on, and therefore had a fair stab at what was about to happen in the region. Maybe not necessarily understanding which country was being targeted, but it was certainly enough to do it. And so that contributed to military operations afterwards, as being able to observe and understand, or better understand, these pipelines. Coming back to the article here, you're talking about an idea that Russia can push an invasion force into Europe, into NATO, within 5 years. Now, let's pretend that all the articles screaming about military capability in Russia over the last 4 years haven't existed. Let's also pretend that the myth of 1 million dead Russians also doesn't exist. Let's pretend that the Russians' military capability is exactly as it was not exactly as it was. They're at full strength So they've got a million men at arms, in essence. They've got their Black Sea Fleet. They've got their uh, well, not so much a Baltic, but I suppose it is the Baltics. They've got their full capability. Now, their ability to strike into NATO is definitely there. They've got the ICBMs, IRBMs, SRBMs. They've got their strategic strike aircraft. They've got their missile capabilities. They've got the naval hardware in terms of attack subs and surface fleet and everything else. Now, we're assuming that they're all functional. So Russia certainly has the capacity in terms of raw military capacity. And I guess you could argue that some of these smaller nations would be overrun if Russia sneezed. Yeah, okay, you could argue that. But other than going into Ukraine in 2022, Russia's not really, well, even then, I mean, Ukrainian supporters may not like me saying this, but it's still a regional level conflict for Russia. I mean, they got mired in Chechnya and Georgia as their major conflicts post 1991. Yeah, seeing how those turned out, and I mean, Grozny as the ultimate example of urban warfare prior to, prior to Ukraine. Further into Europe, I guess urban warfare, or the warfare that had been experienced, was the collapse of the former Yugoslav republics, or the collapse of Yugoslavia. And I guess you look at how Russia performed in Chechnya and Georgia, and then you look at how it's performing in Ukraine, and then you look at where the stance of NATO is. If they're afraid that Russia's going to run over them, then that's more of a problem with how NATO has, or the NATO nations have spent their military expenditure and maintained their capability, or lack thereof. The example that keeps coming up was, now I can't remember what year it was that I read the paper on it. There's a European Air Studies Centre, NATO Air Studies Centre, forget the exact term they use, but basically Air Power Studies Centre in NATO. And they had a critical look at the campaign in Libya, because it was predominantly an air campaign to begin with. And what they found was, in the lead up to it, it was originally a NATO campaign. And America basically said, look, go ahead, do it all yourselves. Make it a European campaign, we'll hold back. And because, America had done things in and around Libya over the years, that was basically an EU-driven concern. So the Europeans launched the initial air campaign and the initial conflict, and the reality, or the impermanence of air warfare, which is one of the characterizing characteristics of air power, was that the air campaign had effect, but it was limited effect compared to what people were hoping. And the Europeans found out very, very, very quickly that their ordnance reserves got exhausted very fast. So the US was drawn into the Libyan campaign to resupply the Europeans. The Europeans still led most of what went on, but it was very much heavily supported by the US. It was a very, very good example from within the last 15 years of the Europeans trying to run a campaign on their own, only to find out very, very quickly that it was unsustainable. Then they weren't set up. They weren't armed or configured to do this. And this is years before Trump came along and said, look, you're not spending enough to meet your obligations and everything else. And so the Libyan campaign was, I guess, the shot of reality across the bow of people saying we have expeditionary militaries and capabilities and everything else. Ultimately, it was through the resupply efforts of the US that the Europeans were ultimately able to get the outcomes in Libya that they were after, and then everything turned to poo. More to poo than was already there. The one European air campaign or military campaign that seems to be mostly working would be the French in Mali. But even then, it's debatable how well their objectives are being met, and militarily, the cost to benefit outcome and everything else. Plus, it's a former French colony. With that, then, compared to the status of Russia, you then got to ask yourself, well, given the example or the reality, I guess, faced by the nations prior to 2022, okay, yeah, you could reasonably suggest that should Russia go west, that the Europeans lack the capacity or the capability to take them on. But Libya was an offensive campaign, not a defensive campaign. And so you're going to have defensive integrated air defense systems and everything else that aren't there. So, if anything, the ground war in Ukraine is the testing ground to see how well NATO's capabilities, because a lot of them have made their way onto the battlefields, have held up against Russian capabilities as well. Now, people say, oh, look at the examples out of recent conflicts. None of them have been near peer, and that's the issue. Despite the numbers of men-at-arms in Iraq, they never really recovered post-Gulf War One, and so, but they still bled the US really hard in 2003. Maybe not as the Iraqi army, certainly as insurgents. Afghanistan, well, bled the NATO contribution there rather well. Somalia, even though there were warlords, there was still some rather poor outcomes. I mean, the Mogadishu Black Hawk Down was seen as the impetus for the US to eventually withdraw from Somalia. If anything, probably the campaign with the fall of Yugoslavia was potentially the closest peer or near peer combat that's been in the last 30 years. But even then, the Serbians managed to shoot down an F-117. There were a number of other fighter aircraft shot down by former Yugoslav forces, and eventually it was weight of numbers that eventually overwhelmed. But there was enough to look at it and go, things aren't as clear cut as people would hope. And so watching these peer/near peer engagements, especially when both sides had the same hardware in eastern Ukraine, should be concerning for military capability planners or theorists or work groups, etc., because you're looking at a concept of not being able to overwhelm a supposedly inferior force. And this is just Russia. You look at the changes that China has had in the last 25 years, and that should send a shiver of fear through anybody who's considering taking on China or considering China as a potential adversary at some point. You really don't want that to happen, honestly. So, back to the article. So yes, Europe is retooling armies, not in response to what Russia did. They're retooling their armies because they ran out of supplies. They gave it all to Ukraine, and just like Libya, they found out that their reserve stocks weren't going to sustain operations. I remember hearing a number of years ago some of the concepts of smaller nations or independent nations with smaller militaries, what the point of the military was during a defensive campaign. That if there was one of the big belligerents in the world was to come and roll over the country, that nation's military, its role basically was a delaying action to hold off invading forces long enough to allow a coalition or to allow the bigger allies that they had to come and show up. And you're talking sometimes on a matter of 15 or 30 days. Now, that was using concepts in force back then. You look at how Ukraine and stuff rolled out. 15 or 30 days hold out initially. Yeah, that's maybe not the reality anymore. So, yes, Europe has had to retool. Same with the US, I guess, about supplying equipment. And, well, it says here Russia's obviously producing tons and tons of hardware. So they're saying, well, they're going to sell stuff off to China or Russia's allies as such. It's assuming that the hardware isn't going to battlefield use at the moment. I don't agree with this point here that the hardware being produced by Russia at the moment is destabilizing things any more than it already is. But it's interesting. And yeah, I mean, that's a fair statement from Putin. I mean, you'd hear a similar statement from any world leader attending their military factories, is that, yeah, the demand for modern hardware doesn't end at the battlefield. It's going to continue on. You've got to prepare for the next war. And the argument that, yep, the Russians are being bled of hardware starts, well, you start seeing the holes that were always there. 400 armed vehicles per year in 2022, give or take, now making 4,000. A shipping 4,000. It's probably a production pipeline even longer. We had the article last week about the drone manufacturing in Russia. And yes, yep, they initially brought the Shaheeds in from Iran, but manufacturing 10 times the rate since 2023. And so, yep, okay, yep, expenditure, fine. They're saying, well, maybe there's going to be a World War II. Look, I don't know. The US, so the Soviet Union, Russia at the time, still was part of Lend-Lease, still acquired material through Lend-Lease, but again, as I was talking last week in the article about drone manufacturing, Russia's got the ability to move manufacturing deeper into Russian territory, further out of reach of long-range missiles and things like that. It's something that not a lot of other nations have, the ability to manufacture in depth away from any front lines. Now, you could say, well, that doesn't work in the context of newer missiles and everything else, but there's got to be a way to effectively do it without committing war crimes, really. Yep, the Ukrainian conflict has certainly become a testing ground for arms and tech. Not new, well, drones have always been around. Even armed drones have been around. I mean, you look at even in World War II, they had early guided weaponry and drones and tech like that. You can look at this as an evolution of that, fundamentally. What it has been a testing ground for is the capability against capability in a rough, not in a near peer environment, but putting up this Wunderwaffe, as people had called them, of Western military hardware against Russian. And the idea that we're now going to see how both sides were going to perform, or the hardware was going to perform from both sides. In the lead up, or 2022, and even if you read a bunch of sources even now, there is no acceptance of the criticism of the failure of the Western hardware to deliver at the standards or the levels that it was claimed, or willing to accept that Russians either have an effective counter for a lot of the stuff or just work around it. And that's a problem for Western military manufacturers and militaries, because the assumptions that underlie force capabilities and force production levels and things like that are not as robust as people are expecting. And I mean, there was a discussions going on, I guess, in the early 2000s about, well, what is the nature of future warfare? Are we going to have asymmetric warfare where you have overwhelming power from one side and not much from the other, i.e. going into Iraq and Afghanistan? But the lessons, the very, very bloody lessons learnt from out of those, was that asymmetric warfare isn't easy, and quite often it's the major military power that's going to lose in practical terms because they get bled out. And so that was certainly chasing things. Militaries were looking at future expenditure on, oh, well, okay, that'll be the main thrust of warfare going forward, and we can shape and build our militaries around that. I mean, New Zealand sort of could no longer fund a lot of their expeditionary capability, so turned more inwards. And, well, yeah, there was a bit of grumbling when that happened, but it was a reality of the ability of the nation to fund an expeditionary military with modern capabilities. Very, very expensive. And was it the right decision? Well, they're protected by geography. So, yeah, it's the Ukrainian battlefield has been very interesting to see how the hardware, relatively modern hardware, competes against relatively modern hardware. And yeah, I think in hindsight, years down track, people are going to say that, yep, it was scary, whether the claimed capabilities of both sides really did not come up to the standard that was proposed. And I guess the relative importance that is being placed on things like battlefield drones. Well, again, those capabilities were always there, but if you just got to look at it from a point of view of, you got to find a way that's going to expose you to least risk and expose them to the most risk. Well, drones is a good way of doing that. So, prior to the Ukrainian attack, it was number 2 world arms supplier behind the US, but using what they've got against Ukraine. But now we've got the thing here talking about the effects on the Russian economy, that it's emerging again as the leading arms sales. And it's also the sort of nations that previously were friendly to Russia, still are seeing offerings of their equipment. I certainly know Brazil's got a mix of Western, Eastern, and natively developed hardware. Malaysia, for a while, had a mix of Eastern and Western hardware as well. So yeah, it's interesting. So yeah, foreign orders obviously going to be good for getting the money into the country, that sort of thing. And basically, in response to battlefield use, if demand hasn't shrunk, then that's a recognition from the nations that are willing to buy it that, yep, no, it performs to a standard when they've got the ability to buy from anywhere, really. And, okay, increased values, etc. It's just a fair bit of stuff. The other big reason I picked up this is not just because it's talking about, oh, yep, Russia's actually got capability. Some of the comments, I tend not to read the comments on these articles. They, yeah. So Russia's producing capability now, and people saying, well, we've got capability that may arrive down track. Okay, people who anti-Russian comments. Okay, the obviously, yeah, people are saying, look, hang on, the whole idea of NATO encroachment may not seem like much to people in the West, but it's important to Russia. And so, yeah, people say, oh, no, we're going to keep doing. Yep, the laser system developed out of Australia. People, complaining about things. Okay. Everything's dysfunctional, random commenters, etc. Oh, yep, okay, they're building a lot of stuff, but it's reportedly poorly made. Okay, well, poorly made Russian equipment is holding the NATO supplied equipment at bay. What does that say? And that's the thing. It's like, here's one of these disconnected thoughts or disconnected from reality. Okay, well, we will buy the first part of the statement as being true, which is that the Russian equipment being used in Ukraine is poorly made, poorly manufactured, in which case you'd expect a remotely capable opposing force to steamroll. But that's not what's being seen on the battlefield. The battlefield hasn't moved, it's static, if anything. So if Russia's not investing in developing a quality modern product, what does that mean for the forces or the equipment being used against them? Yeah. So opinion that doesn't seem to be matched up with the reality of what's going on. Here we go. Regardless of what we've been told, Russian weapons have proven the equal of Western weapons. This is a big problem because the Russians can build equivalent platforms at 40% of the cost of Western weapons are being sold at. They also come with no strings attached like the US weapons do. If you buy US, you virtually have to ask permission to use it or to on-sell it. Yeah, third-party sales. An almighty crash in profits from US arms manufacturers will be the result. Okay, I don't buy that last part. I mean, nations who buy US aren't about to immediately turn around and buy Russian. Now, some will, but they generally don't have the amount of money being invested into US arms manufacturing that is going to cause a crash. But the greater point still stands that it looks like Russia is able to produce an ability to hold Western hardware at bay at a much reduced cost. And when you look at military manufacturing concepts, a nation that can do that, or a side that can do that, is one that ultimately is going to win because they will outlast financially your opponent. So BRICS are the nations that are most rapidly developing, according to this commenter. They're becoming customers, obviously, for military hardware. I won't say that they've been traditionally NATO in Europe. Okay, Brazil, Russia, not Russia. Okay, that's definitely not. Indonesia is in India and Indonesia. India had a mix of Western and Russian hardware, but now develops a lot of its own. C, if we're going to look at C as being China, well, they developed their own, but they largely borrowed and copied Russian material to begin with. S being Spain, maybe. Not sure. Sure who the S is. I mean, Brazil also have their own developed materials. Indonesia had both, but certainly made a move towards American supplied material in the 90s, I think. And so, yeah, you've got, I don't say that they've been traditionally US NATO hardware, but yep, the former Warsaw Pact nations, so yeah, the Baltics and everyone else have largely bought in on Western suppliers. I mean, I think Germany is now completely Western in hardware. I think they got rid of their last MiGs, I think, or they've retired them. And so, yeah, the community is basically saying that you're running out of new markets, and the problem is, well, where does it go? Yeah, okay, Ukraine's jack-in-the-box tanks. Doesn't matter if they're doing the job. And the idea that here you talk about cost of expenditure, the cost of the war, and they're saying that the Russian expenditure matches what a UK-US submarine purchase is supposed to be. Yeah, you talk about value for money. Well, the submarines are going to be cool when we get them, but the point is, I don't think. I mean, if that figure is completely accurate, then that's mind-blowing. Then again, I see that as another reason Russia's position is a lot stronger in this conflict than people give them credit for. Yeah, okay, they fear China. I don't think they fear China. Okay, if Russia is stuck in a stalemate with Ukraine, how can it possibly win against most of the European countries, let alone a united Europe? This person misses the point. How can a united Europe, if there is such a thing, hold against Russia, when all they can do is hold Russia to a stalemate? So this comment comes back again. An interesting change in narrative, one that probably represents reality this time. For 3 years, we've been reading that Russia's military capabilities were a house of cards, that its soldiers substituted shovels for absent guns, that artillery shells and missiles were critically absent, that washing machines were being cannibalized for chips to make missiles, that its soldiers were hungry and freezing, that its entire military was close to collapse, as was its economy. All it needed was more weaponry and money for Ukraine to realize Russia's military demise. Well, that's a pretty decent summary of how the media's been the last few years. Only a few days ago, so last week, Trump described Russia as a paper tiger. The point of the commenter is that it is exactly that inaccurate assessment has prolonged a war that has laid waste to Ukraine. Not unlike Vietnam, where the US Republican politicians were constantly told that communist forces were on the edge of collapse if only another 50,000 troops, planes, etc. were deployed. Victory was just around the corner after all. This article exposes the folly of the assessments given to us for the last 3 years. Militarily, Russia is more powerful than ever, and its economy is nowhere near collapse. The acceptance of reality now brings into question why continue the war. It is not in Ukraine's interest to do so. It is not in NATO's interest to do so. So why continue? Well, you don't want to go down that rabbit hole. Any rationale for not negotiating seriously has been erased by this article. And then people come out and complain about the communist's point about Russia invaded, Russia continues. Why has it failed to subdue a nation less than a third of its population? Well, people, again, never paid attention to the causus belli, that Putin put out, they still seem to think that Russia's intent is to steamroll all of Ukraine. Russia made it to Kiev briefly. Their army now litters Ukraine all the way to their starting point. They fainted to Kiev. They always were going to hold the eastern provinces. It was oblasts. So, guess how many eastern states of Australia you would give up if we invaded? Who's we? It's, yeah. Sometimes I wonder why people get allowed to go on the internet to make comments. One way to get Europe to pay for their own defence, let Putin run. Well, it hasn't worked yet. Didn't work previously. Dear. Now, we're going to jump now to some stuff that's going on elsewhere. So that's the main part there. Obviously, Zelensky likes to complain whenever there's an attack, conveniently shutting up about attacks they're making against Russia. Look, for such a large series of attacks, obviously they're going to be targeting infrastructure. To only have 5 people dying from all these sort of attacks, the targeting seems to be quite good, which is another question about Russian capability, is their targeting seems, well, by and large, pretty decent. And not just their targeting, but the accuracy of deployment. That should be a cause of concern for people. Is that, okay, we've been told that the hardware's failing and they're poorly made, poorly blah, 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 blah. To Ukraine, I see people defending in bunkers and air defense systems and everything else. But for only 5 people to die as a result, well, you could say, yep, great air defense systems. But they're being overwhelmed and Zelensky's crying again. He laughed at the West, its silence in the absence of decisive countermeasures. You've got Patriot batteries, you've got all sorts of hardware. He says Russia's rejected all proposals to end the war, at least halt the attacks. Well, coming out of the Alaskan meeting with President Trump, Russia seemingly had a short list of demands that would be grounds for ceasefire/peace, but Ukraine has rejected those proposals as well. Ukraine's rejected proposals to end the war because Zelensky's unwilling to accept the reality of boots on ground, that the reality that people aren't going to like is that Crimea is gone and Luhansk and Donetsk are gone. They're not coming back. And you can bleed a generation into the ground. I cannot see them coming back. Plain and simple. So they're openly trying to destroy civilian infrastructure. It's targeting gas infrastructure, power generation and transmission. What did you guys just target? You've blown up Russian refineries and factories, and we're busy doing victory laps on that. The major, I forget the name, Zaporizhzhia or something, the big nuclear power plant in the south of Ukraine that Russia's held since 2024. Ukraine keeps shelling it and then crying that Russia's putting the area at risk of, well, nuclear, basically. The Russians have shut down most of the reactors. IAEA observers slash, well, they are observers, I guess. Atomic Energy Agency people are observing and stuff, and there was power cuts to it when the dam was cut and they, well, believed to be Ukrainians that did it. It meant that the cooling ponds for that power plant, the reactors, started drying up as well, and Ukraine continues to bleat that it's Russia putting that reactor hall, that power plant, at risk. Well, it seems that the Russians have done an okay job keeping it safe. They mined the area, that's understandable, but the claims of artillery being fired at it tend to come, the artillery is coming from Ukrainian sources. Now, there was a drone that hit the containment shell building in Chernobyl earlier this year, believed to be a Shahed type drone, so looks like it was Russian origin. But when the Russians were up there initially in the early days of the war, they hadn't really targeted or damaged the power plant. So the questions coming out of that is, well, without better evidence, the claims Ukraine is making about those two nuclear power plants cannot be believed. We'll go with that. Cannot be believed. Combined drone and missile strikes. They're hitting western cities now. I still prefer the original Polish name for that city. So largest aerial assault in the cities and surrounding region. I don't know about that. They've had, it says, they're considered a haven from the fighting early on. When there was, what was it, 2022, I think, early 2023, when a lot of Westerners were heading in to get trained up and stuff like that, and there was the set of images and video of a barracks where someone was playing a violin, and basically everybody's all keyed up, and we're going to win, yada, yada, yada. And then Russia launched a bunch of missile attacks because they'd been able to work out from the footage and imagery where that was, and attacked it. Pretty sure that was in one of these western oblasts. So, bunch of missiles, etc. Strikes. Okay. Zelensky claimed Russian drones used in the attack contained components that are still being supplied from Western countries and various neighbouring countries of Russia. That goes against what that previous article had, and it goes against what the article last week had about capability. And he expressed astonishment that even after more than 3.5 years of war, it remains unclear how to halt the supply of these critical parts. It contains more than 100,000 components manufactured abroad from the 500 drones fired overnight. Zelensky gets harder and harder to listen to. I don't get where he's getting a lot of this stuff from, because it doesn't match up with a lot of the other stuff that's coming out. And clearly, obviously, he's got a priority, but he seems to stretch the truth on things, which makes it hard to believe and support. If they're telling lies to people he wants to support. Over the weekend, it said Russia biggest attack on Ukraine's gas network since Moscow's invasion began. So prior to Euromaidan, one of the reasons Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2, well, Nord Stream 2 in particular, was built was because Europe used to get gas and oil supplies, mainly gas, Russian gas, piped through Ukraine into then European nations. And Ukraine was not paying their bills. They weren't paying their bills on the gas that they were taking out of the pipelines as it went through Ukraine, which is also And so the Russians went, well, we'll deal with that by building a pipeline elsewhere. And so Ukraine's gas network, by and large, is heavily dependent on Russia. Used to be very heavily dependent on Russia. And the rest of Europe also heavily dependent on Russia. So the level of supply, either they're continuing to buy from Russia and everyone's just looking the other way. I don't know that there's enough LNG shipping constantly flowing into Europe to make up for the loss of what was coming through the Nord Stream network. But yeah, this is one of those things. I mean, yep, they're targeting power grid, they're targeting gas networks. Okay, people complain, oh no, it's all bad. Well, what would you rather they do? Target civilian populations? It's targeting infrastructure. All right. It's when I talked about last week, the article about them taking shots at Russian oil manufacturing, you've got to expect a return serve. And, well, Russia's targeting infrastructure. And, yeah, power cuts and everything else. So, yeah, the military industrial complexes, yeah, that seems to back up with what Ukraine's saying, people who got killed or what got hit, etc. The ICC said strikes on the Ukraine's energy grid are a war crime. No. The rationale by which you could argue that it's a war crime is that it targets a predominantly civilian infrastructure or civilian asset type thing. That's a fiction, I've got to say. It's when you look at these things, it's very selective in how they were drawn up, and clearly it's another weapon of war in a way. You could look at it in a similar way to, say, for example, the Emancipation Proclamation during the American Civil War. Now, that's held up as a great, wonderful thing of freeing the slaves, but when you look at it and look at the Emancipation Proclamation, it only freed the slaves in the Confederacy. The slaves in the North remained slaves until the constitutional amendment was passed later. So the Emancipation Proclamation was an article of war that was designed to further put the Confederacy into chaos by unilaterally freeing the slaves down there. Now, obviously, all slavery was bad, but it was not universal. Yeah, a person who was a slave in a northern state remained a slave in the northern state until the constitutional amendment. But the proclamation, great, set the path for the constitutional amendment, but in essence only applied to the opposition. You could look at an ICC warrant like this as much the same. It's, there may be equivalent actions going in both directions, but we're using this as a paper weapon against certain people. I don't see Russia doing that. And the SBU, I don't know why the SBU is saying this, unless that then means there's some stuff going on in Russia that people don't necessarily want to see come to light, done by Ukraine. So, yep, they've attacked refineries, etc. And so, yeah, that's that. Now, there's, in the mix of all that, Putin had some